and found myself in juvenile incarceration. Um, so that's me, Hakeem Crampton. Thank you.
And Nick and Hakeem, can you tell us where you're from?
Yeah, I'm from Jackson, Michigan.
Yep, Detroit, Michigan.
Okay. And moving forward with Aaron.
So my name's Aaron Kinzel. I'm a lecturer of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Michigan Dearborn. I'm also the executive director of the Youth Justice Fund. We are a small nonprofit that serves youth that were sentenced to adult sentences in the state of Michigan, particularly Southeast Michigan. I grew up in the projects of Toledo, Ohio, and then after a few years, I ended up going to rural Monroe County. I was in and out of the juvenile justice system several different times, and then eventually at the age of 18, when some of my peers were graduating high school, I was graduating to the penitentiary. So I ended up picking up a really long 19-year sentence, served almost half of that for a violent confrontation with law enforcement out in New England, out of the state of Michigan. And I still work in reentry. Ever since I came home about 13 years ago, I've just been focused and passionate about helping justice-involved individuals, particularly those with serious and violent crimes, because I think very often those are individuals that are overlooked and their capacity for change and redemption. So myself being an example and others on this panel, we've done some really serious stuff, but we've come really far after our time out of the system. So I think that's important to change that narrative for us.
Thank you for that, Aaron. And can we go to Ahmad?
Yes, how you doing? How are you, Professor? Thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be a part of this panel. My name is Imad Sadeh. I was born in Jerusalem. I was born in '66 and had to live the first 12 years of my life under the Israeli occupation. My family was a part of a revolutionary movement in 1978 due to the fact that we weren't unable to sustain a life down there because of my uncle and father's activity within the liberation of Palestine. In 1978, I migrated to the United States. I wound up in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago. Unfortunately, I wound up in a neighborhood that was infested with racism at the time, called the Marquette Park area. I had to deal with basically a young kid coming into this society that did not speak any English. I had to find, things were being said to me. I had no idea what was being said. Later, I came to find and understand the meaning of words such as sand nigger, towel head, camel jockey. And then there's been a fight ever since. Unfortunately, that coupled with a violent father at home who was abusive to mother and including myself and siblings, I ran to the streets, and I was embraced by gang members when I moved to the back of the yards neighborhood. It's an area that's notorious, very well known for gang activity, especially these days. Back then also, I've spent over 15 years of my life in prison. I went from juvenile to county to state to federal, so I've done the whole complete circuit. So to speak, and I've been out since 2004. That's 16 years. I'm a Johnny come lately to this stuff. I've done it on a voluntary basis since 2004 and before. I've dealt with at-risk youth while I was in federal prison. I've volunteered the rest of the time with different organizations in Chicago. I do work with activists now. We do victim advocacy, and I am going back to school because I believe that I can't do much without having a degree. And they're willing to give me quite a bit of credits for my past experience. I've written an autobiography, and that autobiography should give me. I am a bit offended that people who have no recollection with the community are making decisions for the community. That is the disadvantaged community, and I feel that I have more of a say, and the panelists have more of a say, and the professor have more of a say in what goes on in those communities and what helps those communities. So necessary that I get a degree in order to have a say in those communities, because they restrict me because I don't have those. And I think I've said enough, and I'll pass it on back to you, Professor.
Thank you for that introduction, Amon. And at this point, I would like to ask our first question. And before I do that, I would like to say that this panel is rated R for reality. You will hear the real narratives of people who have navigated these settings. Their comments will not be censored. I do not believe in censoring language. I believe that language is important. And in many cases, our panelists have navigated really tough and violent spaces. And I believe that at some points their language reflects that. And it's important that they use specific types of language to characterize this place and their experiences while they were navigating these issues. So the very first question that I would like to ask our panelists is, in my criminal justice classes, we talk a lot about social factors that lead people to prison or contribute to incarceration. We talk about poverty, we talk about fatherlessness, we talk about the school to prison pipeline and a variety of different social issues in the literature and research. I want to hear from you. Which social factors do you believe contributed to your incarceration and why? And I would like to go ahead and start with Nick.
Yeah, just thinking about, and I think that's a question that I constantly ask myself a lot as I get knee deep into like organizing grassroots policy and how these systems of oppression has an impact on people. When I think back to my childhood, it's easy to say growing up in a fatherless household. I think that's the easy thing to say. When we look at what happens with a child, especially a young Black boy that grows up without a father figure or another male in the house. But I think one key thing is just being a product of the school to prison pipeline. Hey, Hakeem, can you mute yourself? I think just being a product of the school to prison pipeline is what ultimately led me from, having this childhood, constantly being expelled from school after school after school, with the notion that once you're suspended once, then that automatically makes you a bad person. It automatically makes you a bad child. I'm thinking back of how the school failed to answer or even respond to some of the situations that not only myself, but many children would go through when there's an altercation or a fight. We didn't have restorative circles. We didn't have, opportunities where we could come and like do conflict resolution, but it was suspension after suspension, and not having these, structures in place to answer to the childhood trauma that happens inside the school. Ultimately, I found my way inside of a county jail at the age of 16, and it was coming out of a school basketball game. And my innocent way of flirting with a young lady, was telling her about the coat that she was wearing. Back then, we used to wear the shirtlings with the fur around the collar and everything. And I was digging her coat. And as we was getting closer to the parking lot, and I was, just trying to do my innocence of flirting, there was 2 police officers that was walking behind me. And I remember one of the officers telling me to go across the yard. It was dark outside. It's about like 9 o'clock at night. I don't live in this direction. And I responded to the officer saying, like, I'm not going across. I don't live there. Instead of these officers responding to me in a childlike manner that I was in, they responded with hostility. They put their hands on me. They turned me around. They cussed at me. They told me where I needed to be. And by then, being a product of your environment, right? Seeing how the school fails to respond to these situations, even when the police are involved. We have to think about how many of these children that's caught up in the school systems now, that when they show these erratic behaviors, when they have these type of conflicts, they're not getting responded to in the right way. And I think if we would have, if my mother would have had just the knowledge that she has now to go to the school and look for the support, look for the help that I was going through in the classrooms, I don't think I would have ever went into the prison system, right? But we can't talk about the condition of the schools if we don't talk about the condition of the community, right? Why is our schools failing our children? Because of poverty, because of the lack of support that go in there, because of the mental illness that runs rampant throughout the community. So this, like, it not just starts in the household, right? I think it's a huge umbrella of factors that lead a person into criminalization and then lead a person into incarceration. I'm gonna get off now and stop there.
Thank you for sharing, Nick. Hakeem, which social factors do you believe contributed to your incarceration?
Yes, thank you for that question. And thank you for Nick's answer. I think for me, I was born 48 years ago, almost 50 years ago, right after the civil rights era had just achieved much of its successes in the late 60s. Just after Dr. King's assassination, here I was born into an era in a generation in which young African Americans, Black people in America, were supposed to be finally, for the first time, enjoying the freedoms that the civil rights gains had fought so hard to achieve, which included a lot of things that our community was ill prepared for. Segregation of schools, right? Some of those things were happening in my earliest of early childhoods, where I was going to school with predominantly white kids, and I had to come from a Black community, had never went to school with white kids like that. Some of those things were happening, right? And at this time, Black communities and white communities were beginning to merge to a certain extent, right? And so young Black children were then, particularly Black males like myself, were on the receiving end of a different type of response to the civil rights gains. There was a systematic response in the systems that control the social institutions that Black people were now allowed to intermingle with. We were now allowed to freely go into places that we hadn't gone before. And civic life was structured a little bit different, particularly here in the North. Well, I was born into that generation, into that era in the 70s, in which, as I said, as I began to go to school, there began to be systematic actions and policies and practices of racism that began to really plague our community. And simultaneously, there was the introduction of drugs into our community as a way to counterbalance Black progress, meaning that there were Blacks who were making progress academically, socially, financially, and there were people in this country who believed that by controlling the systems that interact with the people's lives, we can control the outcome of what happens to these Black people. What happened to us was they didn't want us to be free. They wanted us to be still incarcerated, right? They wanted us to still live in poverty. So I was a young child raised up in the cross of cultures in which I was ill prepared for. I had no idea. 1983, 84, I was breakdancing, spraying graffiti. By 1985, crack cocaine had hit our community so hard that I no longer wanted to breakdance. I wanted to sell drugs. And sadly, I began selling drugs. My father was a dope dealer from Detroit, a pimp in the 60s. That's all I knew. My father began to sell heroin in the 70s and marijuana in the 70s. So my father was a hustler. My mother left the streets and returned to school and returned to employment to try to get us out of that condition. It was too late for me already. I had already been now arrested by the time I was 11 years old. But before I turned 12, I already had my first felony conviction for felony assault at the school. By the time I was 17, I had my first adult felony conviction in Ingham County. Possession of a firearm, was locked up. By the time I was 18 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I was sitting in prison. And in between the time of 11 years old up to that 18, I had been in and out of juvenile home, in and out of contact with the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, probation and parole officers. And I hadn't gotten a chance to really to find my sense of self, my sense of who I wanted to be in life. Where was my dreams at? I don't know where they ever got cut short at, because somewhere in between the breakdance era and the crack cocaine, I forgot what my dreams were supposed to be. And I dreamed of being a drug dealer. And it ultimately impacted me and many other people like me. And in spite of the fact that I found myself in prison in 91 for a murder, a crime I didn't commit, the lifestyle I had lived up to that point and the decisions I had made throughout my life put me on a course in which I was going to find myself in prison, whether it's for a crime I did or didn't do, unfortunately.
Thank you for sharing. I want to ask you another question, because you said that you got a felony conviction because of a school-related incident. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I was 11 years old in 1984, 85, turning 12. I was in the 6th grade, and we were leaving from our gym, and it was nice out. It was probably May. And the teacher decided, hey, let's walk outside around the school instead of through the school. We began walking outside on our recess yard. While we were out there, I saw some acorns. I picked them up as a little 6th grader and flicked them in my hand and hit some students and laughed. They laughed and looked and wondered who did it. So I picked up some more acorn and threw some more acorns, and the acorns weren't going that far. So I picked up a little rock and I threw the rock. And sadly and unfortunately, that rock hit my teacher. It didn't hurt her, but she did get hit with the rock. I was prosecuted for that, charged as a felon, and prosecuted and convicted of a felonious assault. And I was sentenced to 20 days in juvenile detention, plus 10 weekends of juvenile detention.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. Aaron, social factors you believe contributed to your incarceration?
Sure. This is really multifaceted, response to this. I think, all the social factors that come into play, like Nick and Hakeem have already spoken about, I think it breaks down to two major areas, and I think it's true with my lifestyle as well. It's nature versus nurture. So I think we have some inherent qualities that start to develop and our identity shifts due to our nurture, our environment, our social network, our family, our community. All these things start to kind of influence who we become as individuals. So for me as a kid, growing up in the projects of Toledo, Ohio, this is an area, this was back late 70s, early 80s. My mama was with a bunch of different men. She was a young mother. I think she had me at 17 years old. She doesn't have a job. She has no job training. She's in an economically depressed area where a lot of times, unfortunately, when there's no jobs or opportunity, people develop illicit economies, which means they start selling drugs. They may create, little networks where they're stealing things. Illegal activities have become rampant because of the lack of opportunity. So my mother was involved in that, different men that she was with, very violent criminals, drug dealers. So as a little kid, my network, my nurture is by a lot of individuals doing some really crazy stuff. I see violence in my home. I watched my mother get raped. I was beaten as a child. I've seen people killed in my community just as a little boy. My first police contact, I think, was the age of 5, where my mother was with the man who was kind of like a cat burglar per se. And I was just going around with this man. He was pushing me up through windows, teaching me how to break into houses. So like as a 5-year-old, I'm like an accessory to, different burglaries and stuff, which is just crazy. At that point, I definitely won't take any accountability for my behavior, because how the hell does a 5-year-old understand that that's right or wrong? But, as I grow and develop, later on in life, I think there is a point where I do start to understand what it is that my family's doing, my community, and myself is wrong. So I think there's this point in my early teenage years where I really understand functionally what I'm doing is not okay. And yet I still decide, my nature says, I'm still going to be a part of this, because it's honestly the only thing I've ever known is crime. So I think the worst thing that ever happened to me as far as violence, and I think this is a key thing for violent behavior more often than not, it's these adverse childhood experiences that we have, or ACEs for short. All these experiences I had in my childhood really helped to develop me into an aggressive, violent, hypermasculine male. And that doesn't excuse my behavior and aggressiveness and violence later on, but it helps to explain how I was really groomed to be like that. My stepfather at the age of 8, he beat me within an inch of my life, chased me out of the family home with a .357 Magnum, and unleashed 6 rounds at me, trying to murder me as I ran out of the family home. And I've watched him put guns to my mother before. So like as an 8-year-old, I was almost murdered. So now guns have this really powerful symbol for me. Not only are they a symbol of fear and power, but it's something that I see now as a protection. Like it's something that I need. So in my early teenage years, I start carrying guns, I start selling drugs. I'm in and out of the juvenile justice system, like Hakeem mentioned, mostly with interactions with law enforcement on school property. And that just keeps progressing to where I become more and more violent. By the time I'm 18, my family life has been nothing but the dope life. I'm a deeply traumatized youth. I'm suicidal. Like I was strung out on drugs. And that's another thing that we just don't talk about. Like substance abuse is really deeply connected to trauma. Most people abuse substances because they've never dealt with the trauma that they've had either as children or as young adults. So we have to find ways to kind of like self-medicate because of the lack of, like Nick said, mental health services are not in certain communities, just regular public health in general. Like most people are not seeing a doctor. for sickness or general, let alone the mental health piece. So that's a big problem that we have in communities. So I'm this messed up kid. I'm taught that when I have a confrontation, I respond with violence, no different than when a cop pulled me over at 18. I got nervous. He had his hand on a pistol, was ready to pull me over, and he tells me to get out of the car. What do? I respond with violence. I shoot out the window and start a massive shootout and then go on a high-speed chase. And again, I take full accountability for my actions, but when you look at the timeline, the trajectory, like, it was very clear where I was going when I was a little kid, that I would be headed off from like the school to prison pipeline thing, all the suspensions, expulsions in school, and how I was treated, and to how I just eventually was in the JJ system and then off into the penitentiary. Like, my path, and we can see this with a lot of youth, we can predict the likelihood of them going into the system. And the fact that I had familial carceral connections, like meaning family members that have been justice impacted too, that just made it even more likely for me to get wrapped up into the system. So I think this, again, it's this multifaceted thing. So we've got to look at ways and break down these systemic racist practices that the government often works on to isolate certain communities, the economic standpoints where we're not allowing opportunities for anybody, regardless of racial opportunity. Like this, we need to find ways to build communities and help everybody. So the 1% and corporations and wealthy individuals are not just like creating prisons out of a way to really just house certain individuals and control the masses. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Aaron. And Ahmad, can you tell us what factors do you believe contributed to your incarceration?
Yes, Professor. My main thing, my biggest thing was, one, if you count the years that I grew up without a father in Palestine, in Jerusalem, growing up without a father, it was basically just my mother taking care of us. That's one part of it. The second part of it, coming to this society or to this nation and being placed again with the father, it turns out that maybe it wasn't such a good idea to have the father there, because the father turned out to be a very violent individual who basically almost killed everybody in the house. I mean, there was things I watched my father pick up my mom by her ears and headbutt her, basically shattering her nose, punch her in the eyes so hard that instead of tears, blood came out of her eyes. These things, seeing these things, and then even as young people, we can look around and see the hypocrisy of governments and societies. And if we see that people who control you are doing things and getting away with it, we figure we can get away with it. In this society, there's a misconception, and that misconception is that there is a criminal justice system that is fair and just. And we go do things because we hear about constitutional rights and constitutional and bills of rights and all these things. We actually think that if something happens, we have the legal system to at least you're innocent until proven guilty. When in reality, if you are arrested, you are guilty until you prove yourself innocent. So I mean, in the area that I grew up in, most of my friends were poor. I mean, the neighborhoods were much different. There was big families, there were strong family ties, but it was still poor families with not much to do. The only thing you have to do is go to the park. They supply you in these neighborhoods with a park. The park I grew up in around was Davis Square Park. And if you display any type of negative behavior, you're not allowed into the park, or you're kicked out of the park. I mean, most of the time, if I walked into the park as a known gang member, they would tell me you have to leave. So it was whatever happened in the household and the environment I was in is what led. There wasn't much for us to do. There wasn't much investing in us. They were already shutting down education. They were already on that kick of crime and punishment. Punish them, take away the vocational schools, take away education, fund prisons, fund law enforcement, and defund education. That was already hot and heavy. Not like now. You see a little shift because that hasn't worked. They spent 20, 30 years of that and basically destroyed the nation. And now they're trying to come back to try softly do this rehabilitation thing, education thing. But basically, abuse by the father, abuse in the household, and nothing within the neighborhood, nothing was offered in those areas for young people to do. I walked into the United States Marine Corps office and asked to be allowed to go into the Marines at the age of, I believe, about 14 or 15, and they refused me, told me to go back to school, and I wasn't going to do that because of my gangbanging situation, the things that I found myself into. And I walked back out, and I walked right into the streets. So there's not much for people like us coming out of these disadvantaged areas to turn to, other than whatever is out there in the streets. And it's usually your guys, your homies, your bros, whatever you want to call them. And and we have each other, we lean on each other, and there's not much else to turn to.
Okay, thank you for sharing that as well. Second question I would like to ask is, we see all kinds of television shows that depict prison, Orange is the New Black, Locked Up, all types of television shows that glamorize prison as this, very fun place. It's a great place where people are laughing, but that's not the case in many cases. So can you tell us, what is life like in prison? And let's start with Nick.
Yeah. Man, what's life like? It's definitely not one of those shows. It's not A&E. It's not the Discovery Channel. Although it's good entertainment, and this country is weird because we like to find entertainment enjoyment, in someone's incarceration. Being in prison fucked up, and it is what it is, right? Like, you talking about a place where the idea is to rehabilitate someone, a place where, we're sending a person of a criminalistic mindset, to a place that we call corrections for them to be corrected. But it's hollow, right? It's a institution where all of the resources and the support that a person would need, right, to make this transition in their life is stripped away. During the time I was in there, our education was pulled away. The skills trades was just good enough to get a job within a prison. If I wanted to go learn, get a skills trade in cooking, it's just so that I can get 10 more cents or 25 more cents on my pay working in a kitchen. Under this constant control all day. And you would think a lot of the violence is perpetuated by the incarcerated population, but a lot of it comes from the staff of the administration, the staff of the prisons. When I was in there, it was even to a point like they was taking cigarettes out, and you had people that were spending lots of time locked up, like finding, they're finding solace in a cigarette. And when you take this out, you turn this environment into a hostile place, right? It's a place that's already full of hostility, and through your brokenness with other men that's in there, right? Other people, you try to build these bonds, right? And even building these bonds with these other folks in there, it's still a moment of being traumatized because you want to survive with them. It's a lot of nuances that happens in prison. And I'm not just going to, paint the very ugly picture about prison either. There was moments where out of our broken bondedness, we had to find moments to laugh, moments for excitement, moments of joyfulness while we was in there. There was times where I remember going into like study groups when I was part of the Nation of Islam, and it's our elders in these religious groups that play a huge role in the reentry process or that rehabilitative process of an incarcerated individual. And just as you on the street, you will find, this family type culture within the gang. You find it the same way in the prison. But even with that, having a family ties, like, it all comes with this big bag of trauma. It's more trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma, all in this disguise of rehabilitation. And so you have to really ask yourself, if somebody committed a crime in your community, one thing got to remember, not everybody go to prison to do life, right? 95% of the folks are coming home one day into your community. And so if we are sending a person into this incarcerated institution, to be rehabilitated, to be worked on, but there's more trauma caused to that person and there than it is in the community, what exactly do you expect to come back out into your community 10 years, 15, 20 years down the line? Um, it was a wreck, man, and it was a hellhole. And I'm gonna share a story, where I had my first time my eyes was opened up to the harm that I was putting myself in and my family, but it was around my birthday time. And my daughter, she came for a visit. And like any visit, right? Her and her mom, they come, they're crying. We get our hugs, we sit down. But this one felt different, right? The energy was off. The vibe wasn't real. And this would be the day that I learned that my daughter became a victim and a survivor of a sexual assault. And me wanting to hold my child during the time of this visit while she was telling me about her trauma that she experienced. And I can't beat her to do anything about it. The officers came right in the visiting room, right? After a couple times of giving me the warning that I can't hold my child, they end up putting handcuffs on me in front of my child. And then they walked me into the solitary confinement where I wouldn't speak to my child for the next 90 days. All because I decided that I wanted to hold my child on a visit while she was explaining to me her victimization through a sexual traumatized thing as a kid. So we gotta, there's a lot of stories. Do the fights happen? Yeah. Do the rapes happen? Of course. Right. But there's more trauma of just being incarcerated than you will see with the fights. And no, I once shared that in my last 3 years, I was placed in a level 1. And I still believe that a level 1 facility is the most hostile and the most dangerous to a person before they come home. I'm not sure why our systems are set up to go from a level 4 down to a level 1. And a level 1 is where you have more freedom, but there's more harm that can happen on the yard. I've seen more black men die in a level 1 in my last 3 years than I've seen on the streets my entire 36 years of living. And that's really something to say, right? Whether if we died in the hands of one another or if we died in the hands of because of the administration. But for a person to spend that much time in prison to be rehabilitated, and the last images I see is black men dying. And then I'm placed right back into the community. My 90-day reentry program was tuck in your shirt, make your bunk, don't catch no tickets. There was no therapist, there was no social worker, there wasn't nobody there to walk me through the trauma that I would experience for those 7 years, but the trauma before coming into prison. And then to talk about the stigma a person will have to walk through after being labeled a returning citizen, a formerly incarcerated person, or a person with a felony conviction. So yes, I'll say it again. Time in prison is fucked up. It's not something to glorify. It's not something to be excited about. And if you become a victim of a violent crime or any crime, you need to really think about what it is that you're putting the perpetrator in prison for and to do. Because if that person isn't doing life, they're coming right back into your community. And if you're on the side of the gate of not making sure this person has the support and the resources invested into them while they are incarcerated, they're going to come back into your community, probably worse, if they don't run across people like myself, like Aaron or Hakeem or all the other elders that have taken their time to get the three of us together.
Thank you for sharing that as well. Aaron, how would you describe prison?
Well, we often hear how the American criminal justice system or the prison system is broken in America, but in reality, it's not broken. It's actually doing what it was designed to do back in the late 1700s. It's always had the same purpose. It's probably the most successful design in American business history of our nation. It was there to marginalize, oppress, and control certain populations. So when we started this country, the first thing we did was we built these houses of corrections, per se, in Pennsylvania as a start. These workhouses to create hard labor for criminals, basically just poor people. It's just another way to control, isolate, and marginalize poor people. And as we fast forward, in time, 1865, the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, where African Americans were everybody thought that they were freed and this was a great day of ending slavery. Slavery was just reinvented. So now we take all these workhouses that had predominantly white folks in them, poor white folks, and now we added on this huge layer of African Americans. Now they're re-enslaved in the system. And here we are, fast forward to modern day, it's no different. We have modern day slave houses, predominantly people of color, but also poor white folks are in the system as well. They are, like Nick said, they are controlled. Prisons are literally elements of control. Like everything you do in a prison system is a paramilitary complex. So let me explain that really quick. So for the connection to the military is really, so like the military takes you in, if you want to become part of our armed forces, they break you down, destroy your identity, and then they build you up into the perfect soldier. You know what prison does to you? Very similar. Like there's this hierarchy, and there's lieutenants and sergeants, and there's all these things rules you have to follow. Prisons break you down, but they don't make you into anything. So whatever you become is who you're exposed to on the yard. Like Nick said, you have certain individuals, some of the old heads, as we commonly call them, the lifers, the long timers that they've aged out of crime. They've been on the yard so long, and they have very little interest in criminal activity or violence or any other crazy prison politics that happen on the yard. But then you have a lot of these younger folk like myself. When I first went in the penitentiary, I was all about violence, aggression, asserting myself, taking control of situations, and fighting the administration and correctional staff. So there's this adversarial relationship often between prisoners and staff. But it's also not like you see on Orange is the New Black, or like there's elements of like happiness, I guess. I mean, you might get with some of your friends and you might joke around, but it's really just a facade. You're very often unhappy. You can't have this deep connection to your family. Everything you do is very regimented, daily. You're not getting adequate nutrition. You're starving. You're getting very many people that come out of the system have hypertension and all kinds of other health issues because of the garbage that they're fed. Often anybody that works in a prison kitchen sees that you get boxes of stuff that say not for human consumption. I mean, like, and then you have like corporations like Aramark that come in and often, have food with maggots or just spoiled things, and they're giving this to individuals across the nation. And again, they're utilizing the slave labor. It's not just private prisons. I think we often see private prisons as the problem. In reality, all public prisons utilize private corporate labor of prisoners. Like you got Starbucks, McDonald's, used to be Victoria's Secret. All these other places are getting money from prison labor. So we need this, it's not we, but the government, the people that run the government and these wealthy corporations decided that we need this labor force. We can't compete with China and India and all these third world nations where, they have this really cheap labor. So we utilize it in the prison system, and we oppress people and control them and lock them up long enough to where once they do eventually come out, there's no correction element. There's no like changing them. You get changed by the people that you're around, for better or worse. Taking out the educational programs in 1994, the Pell Grants under the Violent Crime Control Act under Clinton, that devastated prisons because there was a moment back in the 60s and 70s where, there was some educational vocational training where people were actually coming out and doing well. But then in the 90s, when that hit, they took all that funding out, and then all the college programs, voc programs just dwindled. Thankfully, Congress has reenacted allowing Pell Grants back into the system, which is a huge win, I think, for all of us on this panel and everybody in the system, is that now people can get educated, get some skilled labor while they're inside, and hopefully come home and be more competitive in the job market. But in the end, we all got all these fancy titles, and I've got a bunch of degrees, but in the end, I'm always a convict first. That's the last thing that comes after my name. Professor Kinzel is great. No, it's convict Professor Kinzel. That convict element, my prison number 29357, will always come before any of my titles, my degrees, my professional accomplishments, or community engagement. So the weird thing like about prison is like what it's like. A lot of my engagement and my ambition came from prison, from hanging around the right people in there, people that have changed, people that had transformed. And it's not the prison that made them do that. It's just them being around and educating themselves through self-help, peer-to-peer mentorship, learning the law and policy. These are the men that really inspired me to gain knowledge, because knowledge is power. And then I'm able to teach others to share with others and collaborate with collectives. Like in Michigan, we do this huge policy reformation, and it's really led by directly impacted people who all of us somehow, one way or another, learned something on the yard in a positive sense that gave us knowledge, stability, and determination. So when we came out here on the streets, we realized that, our brothers and sisters that are still on the inside, we got to do something to help them. We got to do something to clear the path for them a little bit better for when they come home, because like as individuals come out, like the collateral consequences of conviction, there's like 39,000 of them can't get a job, can't get housing, can't get education, can't do this through 39,000, whatever. We got to change that. And, the prison system, again, it's designed and doing exactly what it was. So we got to really rethink how the system needs to be. People need to be punished. I'm not saying it's okay, like for me to go out and rob people, start shootings. That needs to be like totally curtailed. But you can remove me from society for an extent, but you also have to rehabilitate me, train me, and prepare me for entry back into society. So that's the piece that prisons are definitely missing. And we could have a lot more people that are community engaged and doing the right thing and enhance public safety by, creating programs inside the system.
Thanks for sharing that as well. Let's go to Ahmad. Can you tell us what is life like in prison? What was your experience?
Well, I could tell you this. I spent, like I said, a total of probably, over 15 years in prison between juvenile, state, and fed. I spent 13 years in federal prison alone, being shipped across the country. Started out in downtown Chicago for 19 months. I spent a year in the hole. I went down to 125 pounds, and I was about as white as that door behind me. And in that sense was because I refused to cooperate with the government and my friends. Then I was shipped from there to Wisconsin, and I spent about a year there in the middle of the woods in a place called Oxford, Wisconsin. Then they shipped me to Pekin, Illinois, and I spent from 94 to about 98 there. Then they shipped me from there to Indiana, Terre Haute, Indiana. From Indiana, they shipped me to Milan, Michigan. From Milan, Michigan, they shipped me to Oklahoma. From Oklahoma, they shipped me to Louisiana, Oakdale, Louisiana, in the middle of the boondocks. Listening to Americans who were born here speaking a language or speaking in a tongue, I couldn't even understand them. I thought that I was in a foreign country. I lost a nephew when I was in prison. There was no comfort in that. My mother suffered by herself. I spoke to my mother every single day, at least for 2 minutes, because you get a time limit on your minutes for the month. You only get so many minutes a month on the phone. If someone in your family, I had friends who lost their mothers, they couldn't go see them. They couldn't say goodbye. Staff, most staff, not all, but most staff treat you like an enemy. You looked at, if you are awake and you're conscious of what's going on, you realize that you are basically just a commodity. Prisons need a commodity, and that commodity is human beings. And for the wheels to turn, law enforcement, politicians have to pass laws strict enough and wrong enough to allow police to arrest and then allow the system to prosecute, with giving them leeway to do whatever they want with you, and basically step all over your constitutional rights and do whatever it takes to get you into that prison, because prison and prisons are a business. And that's it, and that's all. Sitting in a room that's no bigger than your bathroom at home for a year, 2 years. I have friends who spend 15 years in that cell. It used to be a prison in Illinois called Tams. I have good friends that spend 15 years locked down, not able to talk to basically anybody, go out of the cell for 15. Imagine being in your bathroom for 15 years, being only able to come out an hour a week or an hour a day if they get to you that day to take you out. Imagine spending 15, 16, 13, 10 years in a bathroom. Imagine that. Then, as Aaron spoke about the prison system being a business, they take contracts from the street. There was cabinet making factories in the prison that used to be done by people, private companies on the street. They took that contract away from them and they put it into the prison system. Now, if you get a chance, I would like for you to Google federal or judges who were convicted of taking money from private prisons in order to sentence young, poor kids, whether they be African American, Hispanic American, or European American, taking hundreds of thousands of dollars to convict and sentence these young people to lengthy prison sentences. One received a 40-year sentence, one received a 25-year sentence, and this is the way it is. We in the disadvantaged communities are the prey. And these prisons and politicians who indulge in this, for instance, I'll give you an example, I'll cut and I'll move somewhere else. When I was in federal prison, there was a company that sold a product in the commissary. The commissary is the prison store. The name of the thing was Keefe. They had Keefe coffee, Keefe this, Keefe that, Keefe this, Keefe that. Well, guess who owned that and who was supplying the commissary? It was Bob Dole's wife. She held a great interest in that. And we purchased it, and there was no other store to go to. That's where you go to. Prisoners work in a factory for about, starting out, I think about 34 cents an hour. 34 cents an hour. You'll be lucky if you get up, if you're doing big, when you're doing 60 cents an hour. I think their checks were about 160 a month, 130 a month. It is nothing but the continuation of enslavement of the people in this nation. I mean, what is there to glorify about prisons? Most of the movies don't make, and it's nothing like the movies. It's hell. You're there by yourself, and then a simple bump on the shoulder to another inmate can cause a riot in the institution. A simple bump, you walk through the halls are tight, you bump someone by accident, and this guy happened to be from Detroit, and you happen to be from Chicago or California, and this is in the federal prison system. In the state, it might be different. It might be GD and Vice Lord, Latin King and Latin folks, and the whole place gets tore up. Your life, I mean, I seen a guy run up and down the compound and stab people indiscriminately. I seen people with mental problems from the Cuban Mariel boat lift who couldn't get an out date. They had finished their sentence and they were still in prison 15 years later. Walk out into the middle of the compound with razors in front of staff, trying to get attention to their plight, and take a razor and cut their arms just like this in the back of their legs. There's nothing glamorous. There's nothing nice. There's nothing good. I suffer from anxiety, heavy anxiety these days. And most of it comes from being in those situations. You're constantly on guard. You're constantly in fear for your life from staff and other inmates. And it's not you're going through scare. It's just drama. It's constant drama every single day.
Thank you so much for sharing that as well. Can you tell us, and I won't direct this question to any specific individual, can you tell us about your experience in solitary confinement and how did that impact you? I know this is a very sensitive question, so I won't direct this at anyone else. Whoever feels comfortable speaking about it, I will allow you to do so.
I'll go. Solitary confinement, oftentimes inside prisons, is generally called segregation. In the political world of things, oftentimes it's called solitary confinement. And prison itself isn't itself solitary. Prison itself is segregation from society. So when you're incarcerated, there's rules that institutions have, a common rule book, so to speak, that everyone inside the institution must follow, every prisoner must follow. And then there's also administrative rules that the staff must also follow. And there's generally a clash between those two things, because you have to remember that we've gotten ourselves incarcerated because for some reason or another, we came in conflict with law enforcement. in which we was accused of breaking the law, violating the social order. Inside prisons, that is easy to happen as well. We're in constant conflict with law enforcement, known as correction guards. It's easy for us because of such a small, tight-knit environment, because of so many rules being imposed in order to control us, so that the environment is conducive to correctional control. It's easy for people to find themselves regularly in conflict with law enforcement or corrections guard and find themselves written up, find themselves in a position to where they have to defend themselves to the institution's policies, to the institution's code that you were accused of violating, and you find yourself in segregation or solitary confinement. Now, I spent a lot of time in segregation, solitary confinement, simply because I was what was called an inmate leader, meaning that I was involved in a religious organization in prison that put me in a leadership position, and that instantly put me in conflict with the administration. The administration felt that no prisoner should lead anything with regard to other prisoners, whether it be spirituality, whether it be, for example, a gang, for example, right? They felt that no inmate should lead that. So people like me found myself regularly in segregation. And so inside segregation or solitary confinement, the first thing I want to tell you about is this, is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, being incarcerated is solitary confinement, to be kept away from society. So now you're in prison, already segregated, and then you're put in the solitary confinement. It's one of the most loneliest places for a human to be. It's one of the most debilitating places for a human to be. It's one of the places to where the spirit of the human being can be easily crushed, because as humans, it is our nature to be social beings, right? When we're deprived of our ability to socialize, to communicate, to have meaningful human relationships, that hurts us psychologically, and it's a systematic psychological repression, right? To such an extent that while I was in segregation, I've met many, dozens of men who, for a lack of better terminology, have lost their minds while in segregation, right? For a lack of better terminology, have simply separated themselves from clear coherency and control over their mind, because so many other elements now impact and affect the human nature, the human spirit. Now, you remember, to be taken from society and deprived of your human nature, right? To socialize and to love and to be loved and have family or relations and things as they, to be deprived of that already weakens the spirit's desire to grow as a human, because the things that feed it have been cut off. It's the reason why when people are incarcerated, we crave outside attention, because that's one of the things that feeds our human spirit. So when we cease to get letters and contact and phone calls from the outside world, and our isolation is really guaranteed, when we're in segregation in prison, our isolation is buried deep, deep within. It's very painful to be in segregation. Now, I've spent, like I said, I've been in 3 different prisons, or about 5 prisons in 3 different states: Michigan, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma. Every prison I've been in is totally different. Every segregation system is totally different. Corrections guards in each system I've been in treat people different. While there is a similarity in treatment, overall, the treatment of people in segregation is the worst of the worst, because individuals inside segregation now are the furthest removed from society. So when you think about a person in prison, the most undesirable people are in prison. And when you're in prison, the most undesirable of prisoners are in segregation. So you can imagine the feeling that a person has to be the least wanted human being on the planet Earth, somewhere locked away, put into a room and mistreated, barely fed, barely showered, barely any recreation. It's the worst condition you can have a person in. And no movie, no television show can accurately depict that. They can attempt to, but for a person, what you are feeling inside, that can't be depicted.
Thank you. Anyone
If I
else?
say so, yeah. So I think the history of solitary confinement is really interesting. So by definition, it's 23, 24-hour lockdown. So it's a restrictive housing unit. So like Hakeem was going toward, prisons themselves are isolating. We segregate, individuals, but like it's like a prison within a prison. So it's like the deepest depths of hell. It actually started out as an experiment by the Quakers with really positive mindset in place at Eastern State Penitentiary in the early 1800s. So the Quakers believed by isolating prisoners, instead of keeping them together in a congregate system to where they would interact, that they would find penance through God and that they would work in their cells, and they would come out as redeemed human beings. Interestingly enough, that experiment went very awry and very bad very quickly. And we have documents to this day with mental health professionals back then that observed this, like Hakeem said, this mental health that they functionally fucked up. I don't know how else to say it other than that. Severe mental health conditions and psychotic episodes are brought on very quickly by people that are put in these segregation spaces. So we've known this for over 200 years, that this is a phenomenon. So that's the interesting historical piece. So shortly thereafter, they started to change that practice a little bit, and solitary has kind of ebbed and flowed over the years, but it's always stayed a core at some prison nationally. Why? And why do we even have it to this day? Because it is the ultimate mechanism of control. It is used as a way to break individuals that the correctional administration deems they cannot control. So that may be individuals who are, like he mentioned, he was in a leadership role. Other prisoners who are not obeying certain rules, they take them and they put them in this space to where, they're locked in this room 23, 24 hours a day. They may not even see sunlight or get out for a shower or get commissary or any of the extra like things that you get on a general population yard, which is honestly a lot that kind of helps your day to day, but like you're starving in there. And the psychotic episodes come on very quickly. I myself, having done a lot of LSD and other psychedelics as a young teenager, there was a time when they turned my water off for 3 days, and they gave us something called food loaf, which is basically all the food that they've cooked over the last 2 weeks, mix it up, bake it into this loaf, give it to you. This is and honestly, the first day I wouldn't eat it. Second day I was starving and I knew it was garbage, so I ate it. I got sick. I spent the next day and a half puking my guts out from this garbage that I ate, and then no water. On the third day, I started hallucinating like I was on 4 hits of LSD. And it was not a creepy, cool, like awesome experience. It was very dark, demonic, anxiety stricken. It was probably one of the worst, like 72 hours in my life going through that. And people come out of there changed dramatically. Like I think Ahmad was saying too, like, I think all of us on this panel have some level of anxiety or PTSD, particularly for those that have been in segregation units, because now, since we've had this disconnect from society, we have this mental disconnect from other human beings. So our brain is actually programmed in a way to keep us with proximity, from really engaging with other individuals, from having really strong relations. Doesn't mean that we don't have them. It just makes it harder for us to be around people because of these things that we faced in the system. And lots of bad things happen in these units. I watched a young kid that was 18 years old through coercion of other prisoners and also correctional staff who was having a rough time. He was never incarcerated before. They brought him right to a Supermax facility that I was at. And within like a few days, this kid hung himself through instruction through other prisoners and guards that egged him on and said, look, I can't take it in this cell. I need to see a medical professional. I'm not doing good. 5 days, this kid ties a rope around a sprinkler system, not a rope, sorry, but a sheet, but that's what people use as a rope in the system, and he hung himself. Like, that's crazy. And then like imagine like people will cut themselves with razor blades. I've watched guys pull out their intestines, cut themselves in their bowels, and hold pieces of their intestine bleeding out, like the craziest stuff you will see in a horror flick. And this is the real deal. This is not like you see on Orange is the New Black, someone cries for 3 minutes and the episode shifts over and they get out. These are people that are weeping, physically harming themselves, and going through all kinds of crazy psychotic episodes. The worst case is killing themselves. The second worst is trying to kill themselves because they can't deal with this isolation. And it can happen for months, years. The longest I ever did was 10 months straight, and I'm still not like all there in my head because of it. But I have friends that, they've done a few years in there, I met a guy once that came home a couple years ago. He did 35 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections, mostly in segregation units. And this guy is just batshit crazy. I don't know how else to explain it. He needs to be in a very isolated, controlled, like asylum. In all honesty, like this guy is just right out there. He can't function in society, but he shouldn't be incarcerated either because of what the administration did to him. But he needs help. So it's the worst of the worst. Segregation is something, particularly for youth. It's bad enough putting adults in these systems. The first time I got in these units, I was a 15-year-old kid. And when we do this to kids that are cognitively not aware or mentally where adults are, it does irreversible damage to youth. And there's all kinds of literature that talks about the science behind that, where it just destroys parts of the prefrontal cortex, hits on impulsivity, and keeps you in that very instinctive mindset as youth.
Thank you so much for sharing that as well. Go ahead, Amon, really quickly.
Yeah, real quick. I said I spent about a year in segregation in downtown Chicago on my federal trial. A letter was sent by the prosecutor to the institution saying, lock this guy up. It was basically a punishment for refusing to cooperate with the government. But I spent almost a year there. I went down 125 pounds. I was white as a ghost. And I watched, my cell was directly across a cell that was used for treating misbehaving inmates within segregation. And it was a bed, what's called a four-pointer. They would four-point inmates who were not conformist, and they would shoot them with Thorazine and would lay there for about 2 days with no clothes on, pissing and defecating on themselves with no one to clean them. And the staff, the guards, human beings like you and myself, would just pass by laughing, smiling, and you would hear them talk about this stuff as if it was nothing, as if it was a joke. And they went home at the end of the day to their family, wives, and kids, acting like a human being while they were acting like animals towards us.
Thank you. Our final question before we open up for our Q&A session. When you matriculate from a prison setting, many people have difficulty finding jobs, housing, all kinds of challenges. What challenges did you personally navigate before you were able to obtain the career or profession that you are doing today? Let's start with Nick.
College. Big shout out to University of Michigan. I just got accepted into the School of Social Work to complete my master's. But it's been a fucking journey to get there. And going through social work and just having this idea that, there's a institution that's supposed to be there to help folks like myself that's formerly incarcerated. And when you show up and get denied from internship after internship after internship, it's a sad thing. And have to really, have the dialogue on academia, have the dialogue not only on academia, but a lot of these organizations and groups that are supposed to be there to do the work and support, formerly incarcerated and directly impacted folks. And yeah, like Hakeem said, right, the model of just leadership is those closest to the problem, closer to the solution, but further from resources and power. And when we understand that, and you're turning people away, right? Somebody that's coming home from prison and going through the whole college scene and saying, yo, I want to do better. I want to do for my community, and getting turned away from these same institutions. That's been something to really navigate through. I've been denied from a lot of jobs, and I think it's ideal, right? I got denied from Family Dollar, Walmart, you name them. I have an armed robbery. One of my cases are armed robbery on a business. So I definitely get that. But at the same time, it's been real tough to navigate life as a felon. Right now, today, I embrace the felony, right? I embrace my time and my experience being incarcerated. It makes me nor breaks me, right? But coming straight out of the institution and into the community, it just feels like you walk around with your crime on your forehead and people can see it. And it's a sad thing when, going into jobs and having to explain that, getting turned away just because of a felony conviction that you might have committed 15, 20 years down the line. It's been hard finding housing, right? Even to this day, I make great money. But it's about finding a homeowner that will really want to rent their house out to me, or finding a business that will want to rent, their apartment out to me. So those been the troubles of having to navigate. And I think many of us that come out of the correctional system navigates through those same harms. Never really expect to see it in academia, but it's there. I first met you, Charles, in the School of Social Work, right? And you being like one of my first Black professors. And so imagine that experience of going through the community college where, it's expected for me to talk about my experience because I'm being tokenized by the school, but I'm not allowed to work in the areas where I can actually help people that walk the same path as myself. Even at the school that I graduated from, my bachelor's, and where I met Dr. Bell, I never got the support from that school. As many campaigns, from doing bailouts for Black moms to closing down children's village, so many other campaigns that never got the support from the school. And I remember a class project where we had to go in the community and learn about the community. And they had all of these communities around Detroit. They had Hamtramck, they had Southwest Detroit, but there was nothing in Detroit. And I had to ask, not only my class, but my professor, why? Why is this? And one of the classmates had made a statement about not wanting to go into the hood to get carjacked and robbed. And, for me, it was like, wow, is this what you see? And, what about me being in this institution? When I say that I'm formerly incarcerated for armed robbery, do you see me as being that violent individual? Do you see me as being the felony or what my crime entails me to be? So it's been a journey. And over the last, I don't know, probably the last 5 or 6 years of just stepping into my power, stepping into my reality that, I'm a felon and I'm here. It doesn't stop me from who I am. And if I can't get the job, I'll create the job. And so that's how Michigan Liberation and the job that I do now comes aboard. We create it, we raise money. And not only is this something for me, but becoming a main employer to many other formerly incarcerated people. But not only just formerly incarcerated, like a specific juvenile lifers, folks that spent, large amounts of time in prison, understanding that when I seen these folks get the jobs, and their managers will call me to say stupid stuff like they have an attitude or they don't know how to communicate. And I'm like, duh, they've been in there for the last 29, 30, 35 years. And you're trying to come at them with the same sense of control that we experienced in the prison system. If you hire a formerly incarcerated person, it would be the greatest experience that you can have. It would be the most dedicated, most loyal thing. But we have to get over the stigmas that hold so many of us back. Don't judge me by my case. That's what I went to prison for, to get it all right. But when I come home and be vulnerable to tell my story, don't tokenize the story either. I hate employers that love to just say, well, we hire returning citizens, but you're not doing the right steps to ensure that returning citizen is being productive and successful so that they can go up the leadership ladder in the organization or at that employment. So yeah, it's been a journey. The first couple years, fighting the felony stigma, feeling a lot of imposter syndrome, feeling like I couldn't do the things that I really wanted to do, and going through school, social work, organizing trainings, a lot of healing. I think a lot of us get this whole healing thing misconstrued, but went through tons of things just to address my trauma and my healing has helped me step, forward and away from that stigma of being a felon.
Thank you so much for sharing that. One final individual, Aaron, can you tell us about your trajectory to get where you are today? What barriers did you encounter? Tell us more about it.
Similar to Nick's story, like I had lots of issues getting into academic institutions. And then even the ones that did let me in, like there was issues about me getting housing on campus, me getting a job on campus because of my violent past as well, which happened like 20 years previously. Like it's just insane, how many collateral consequences there are for us coming home. I was what I joke and say, I was in the convict closet When I first came out in 2007, I didn't talk about being in prison to anybody. The political space was very different back then. It's not very advocacy oriented like we have now, where people, who are justice impacted are leading a lot of movements. So I just tried to get out and just get regular jobs. But every time I would fill out an application, I was denied repeatedly. So I just kept staying in school. It wasn't until my first 5.5, 6 years out that I finally got hired by Western Michigan University. My first job was as a part-time professor because I had just received a master's degree and was starting my doctoral program. And I never planned any of this. It just happened to be accidental, to be very honest, that I got into academia. Because that was the only pathway that I found left for me to get into around 2011, 2012. But other than like that, which I think is important, is that whole time when I came out, not only was I striking out at the job stuff and I was really determined and well skilled after getting all these degrees, my relationship with my wife was a huge issue. And my family, they didn't understand, Aaron, why are you so fucked up? And I knew I was messed up, but at the same time, I didn't really deeply understand, now that I study trauma from an academic and scientific lens, how messed up I was and how to treat myself and reach out to therapists and realize that I can be, this a man and cry and talk about my feelings and say, I miss my baby girl. I want to see my child and interact with my kid in a way that I didn't get when I was, a little boy, because my parents were just violent assholes, and treated me terribly. So now I have a loving relationship with my kid, but at the same time, I don't know how to be a father. So I think that's a huge piece that we don't talk about with reentry, is family reacclimatation and the social acclimatation piece. Because you're in prison for a long time, you come out this puffed up, hyper masculine, like Nick was saying, these juvenile lifers, I work with a lot of them, and a lot of them are really good people, but they're rough around the edges because they've been locked up since they were kids. They don't know how to go out and have a healthy dating relationship or work with their kids or hold down a job. We need to find ways to create these pathways for them so we can train employers and train educational institutions how to deal with these individuals. So there's this seamless process for them to come home and be productive citizens. We've got to hit on that trauma and all these this reassessment process of how do we reprogram people that have been locked up for decades. We can't just let people out and just expect them to the world just hits reset and is okay. So that's a big thing we got to think about nationally.
Thank you so much for sharing all your narratives. It's been very informative for my students and for our viewers who are watching via social media. We have a few questions. I'm going to take one from my class, and then I'll come to the live stream on social media. So our first question is, I believe it's aimed at Nick. That's from Destiny. Nick, they've watched your video in my class. I show it every semester about how you were working for Habitat for Humanity and why you were incarcerated, and then you were denied an opportunity to work for that very same company. I'm pretty sure Destiny and my class would like to know, how does it feel? How did that feel to have worked for that company in prison and then to walk in there, apply for a job, and just feel that you would have it because of that prior experience and only to be turned away? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, let me add some more onto that. I felt like I was going to have the job because the two women that gave me the interview, beautiful women, Black women, I felt so good having that interview. And yeah, I got the call and got denied because of my armed robbery and a felony conviction. It's embarrassing. One, two, it really hurts. It's a deep sore for that to happen. And I've raised my voice many times to the Department of Corrections. They had some forums where, I disrupted the forums to speak about this. I talked to some folks with Habitat for Humanity. And, even with the work that I do now and having to build partnership and coalitions with certain organizations, it always feels weird when you have these different companies or entities that profit off of prison labor at the table, right? It feels weird when I see Habitat for Humanity at the table and knowing that in certain aspects with Habitat for Humanity, as a formerly incarcerated person, you won't be employed there, right? I'm not sure where they're at now, right? I've been home for little over 7 years now, and I started to advocate about this in my first 3 years home. And we went through a lot. I'll tell you another one that was really funny. Whole Foods. A lot of prison labor happens in Whole Foods. I want to say that they grow their tilapia, the fish, in prison. And I remember I went on the radio and was talking about how Whole Foods does all of this prison labor and it doesn't employ formerly incarcerated folks. And a week later, I went to go put in an application and they actually hired me, right? They actually gave me an opportunity right there on the spot, paid me about $17 an hour. And it's opened up the gates, right here in Michigan for other formerly incarcerated people, not only to get a job at Whole Foods. It doesn't just stop there. But I talked to some people at Whole Foods, and once they learned that a lot of us go to the prison system and get a skills trade and horticulture, that, if we come home and have community gardens, so forth and so on, there's resources that Whole Foods would like to support, right, and send over to folks that are formerly incarcerated. So now you see a lot of us, and when we see these harms happen in the community, we raise our voice about it. And the thing is, you got to stay on top of it and not just raise your voice, but to take deliberate action. So now a lot of the food drives in the city of Detroit, I say at least 70% of the food drives in Detroit are led by formerly incarcerated folks. And they're getting semi trucks full of food in one day, and they're feeding their entire community. And we have to go back and ask ourselves, why is places like Whole Foods giving us this much food to feed the community? Because they, at one point was doing the whole prison labor thing. At one point wasn't hiring formerly incarcerated people outside of prison until we come home and make the noise, right? Until we come home and take action. So I don't know where Habitat for Humanity is at now. I'm not going to let up off of them. I'm always going to stay on top of their head. But yeah, that one really hurt. And to graduate, I had my degree. It wasn't no bachelor's or anything. It was associates. But for me, that was a major step to go from a high school dropout, prison, and then come home straight to college. And thought that I would land something with Habitat for Humanity that does stuff in my community, that does things for poor Black and brown bodies. And to be denied from it was hard.
Thanks for sharing that as well, Nick. I'm gonna take a question from our live stream. I'm gonna aim this one at Hakeem. You gave a very thorough breakdown of the social factors that contribute to incarceration from a historical component. How do you feel that we should go about breaking this generational trauma that we've entered?
Wow.
In 2 minutes on that.
That's a powerful, important question to get into the specifics of how do we and what do we do in order to break these systems. That's a critical question. I think that we are all seeking an answer for, but that doesn't mean that we don't have some suggestions, even though we may not necessarily have the answer, right? Because that's a big question. But I think that what's critical to understand about steps to take is that it's gonna take people, right? It's gonna take the people in America to actually begin to re-examine our justice systems, our social systems, to re-examine them in light of historically, how have they actually evolved and how have they contributed to the United States Constitution providing its people with liberty, right? We have to ask that question because everything at the very heart of these conversations centers around the governance of the United States Constitution that governs the conversation we're having. It governs the conversation we're having because incarceration, the penological system, as one of the wings of white supremacy and racism, as one of its wings, right? Its wings exist because the United States Constitution affords it its protection under the 13th Amendment. Because of that protection afforded under the 13th Amendment, we still have a country that is set deep in punishment to try to administer justice against people, right? So it's going to take the people to re-examine the social structure and the social systems that have continued in maintenance in America to sustain some of these social systems that is breaking people, that are harming people and destabilizing people's communities, because that's what's happening. And that conversation centers around a very serious question about race, right? Because the social systems, the criminal justice systems that exist are being controlled by a very specific race of people here in America. That conversation has to be had. We have to have the conversation about how does this country relinquish its race dominance control over its systems? Because the equity that is lacking, the liberation that is lacking, is a direct result of white supremacy, it's a direct result of racism. We have to have that hard conversation about how do we begin to infiltrate these systems. What I mean by infiltrate these systems is we have to get inside these systems, take up position in these systems, and deeply uproot from within the systems. Because it's apparent that attacking the systems from the outside is simply like throwing rocks at a brick building. You have to actually get inside and tear the structure down from within, because the outside is so fortified and so protected that that conversation that most of us aren't having is protecting that foundation. That conversation we refuse to have, we refuse to challenge white social systems and structures of racism and power in America. And if we don't challenge that and have that conversation, we'll be on the outside throwing rocks from at the outside. We got to get within the inside and tear the walls down from the out and inside so that people on the outside can see what's happening in the inside.
Thank you so much for that analysis. Ahmad, I have a question for you. Destiny says, you mentioned how not having a father contributed to your incarceration. Do you mean in terms of having a lack of supervision because your mom was spread thin with work and raising all the kids? Or do you mean because you lacked a male role model? Or was it a little bit of both?
I did answer that, Professor, but I'm glad you asked me that. In reality, I was actually better raised by my mother without a father. While I was in Jerusalem, we were the best behaved kids. We were poor, but we were the cleanest kids. Mom would go to a cookie factory to work and leave me in charge since I was the oldest, and we behaved. This is the issue. So at the time, I yearned for a father figure. I was growing up without a father. I watched other kids with fathers. My mother had to defend us a couple of times. And that was a horrible feeling, not having a father there. Uncle was doing 125 years. So there was no males in the household. Grandfather in prison, father in prison. Father exiled and uncle in prison. No males. So mom had to defend. So at the time, I yearned it. Now, then coming to the United States and being putting that father in the midst of the family and him turning out to be a very abusive individual, physically abusive, drove me to the streets. So you can gauge what you want out of that. It was awful not having him, and it was horrible having him after. I don't know if I answered that, but
yeah, thank you so much for answering that question. Let's see. Hakeem, you were in prison for a wrongful conviction. How did that feel? Is there a stigma that you still experience even when you were wrongfully convicted of this crime?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that question in the chat as well. I was hoping I would answer that. You know, this is a huge dichotomy for me. In order to answer that, I have to posit this dichotomy, right? So I was a kid that was raised up in the streets. My daddy was a hustler. I used firearms. Sadly and unfortunately, I shot people with firearms, multiple people, as a matter of fact. And I was never convicted of them. I either beat the case, got the case dropped, got it thrown out, or whatever. And I was just a kid, 17 years old. By the time I was 18, here I was now in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, picked up for a murder that I had absolutely no knowledge of. Didn't even know the murder had even occurred when I got it placed in custody. So I literally don't know who committed the crime. Nevertheless, I got convicted of it, sent to prison. I'm sitting with a 45-year prison term. The dichotomy is so deep because at that time in my mind, I knew I didn't belong in prison for that murder. But deep in my heart, I felt I belonged in prison, not because I belonged inside a broken system designed to destroy me, but because knew I had gotten away with so much stuff in the community that I was shocked that I wasn't already in prison for something I did. So when I was in prison fighting to clear my name, it was one of the greatest feelings to not be actually guilty of that crime. Because here it was, I was being accused of murder. One of the most atrocious things that you can do to humanity is take a life from it. But while I was capable of having done something like that in my community, I was so grateful that I actually didn't do it. So that by the time I actually got out of prison, to declare that I was innocent of a murder was one of the greatest joys to me. So I proudly announced who I was, that I had been to prison, I had been wrongly convicted of a murder, and that I didn't belong there for that particular crime, right? Because that put me in a different category than everyone else that I had came home with, who we were coming home as convicted felons, right? We're coming home with the stigma of being a murderer, a robber, a rapist, a drug dealer, etc. I was coming home with the stigma of being an innocent person, having been framed, wrongly convicted of murder, and had a story to tell. So the stigma never affected me. The stigma never got to me like that because I was innocent of the crime in which I was convicted of. So I was proud to yell my story from the top of my lungs. So it was no surprise for me and people in our community that while I still was in prison in the 90s, I was already actively involved in my community from prison with criminal justice advocacy. I was already well-known involved. By the time I got home, I already had a lengthy resume, having worked with nonprofit organizations, did criminal justice and juvenile justice advocacy from prison, all kinds of things I had done from prison. So when I walked out of prison in a different stigma, a stigma of, this is a guy that went to prison, has a story to tell, and he's going to help other people understand what happens in prison. So the stigma never affected me, but at the same time, the dichotomy of being convicted of a crime I didn't commit, a murder at that, still weighed heavily on my heart and my chest because, now mind you, I didn't tell you this, I was sentenced to 45 years in prison. I'm supposed to still be in prison. I won my freedom after 15 years with the help of the Wisconsin Innocence Project, who took my case to the parole chairman. And the parole chairman said, you know what? I believe your innocence. I'm going to let you out on parole. That was 15 years ago. I am still on parole right now today, 15 years later, and I still have 15 years left of parole according to the state of Wisconsin. So the stigma of being on parole is greater to me than the stigma of being convicted of murder because I was innocent of that murder. But being still remain trapped on parole, having to report to a parole agent every single month, having to urinate in the cup and blow a breathalyzer to this very day, right, is the most burdensome stigma of being connected to a criminal conviction for me.
Thank you so much for sharing that as well. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. I would like Aaron and Nick to address this question. We have one question from our virtual audience on Facebook. They wanted to know some resources for folks to deal with trauma and their experiences behind bars. And I know you two are doing great work, Aaron with the Youth Justice Fund and Nick with Michigan Liberation. Can you speak about some resources that may be available for the community quickly?
Yeah, so I partner with a lot of clinicians in the community. So what I do with the Youth Justice Fund is I use my lived experience and my professional development in creating curriculum, marry that with social work practice and psychological practice to hit on trauma-informed care services for my clients. However, I work with Wise Mind PLLC. They're a mental health organization that works throughout Southeast Michigan with like 5 or 6 different locations. They're doing a lot of virtual stuff right now. They take Medicaid and also different options for private insurance as well. I would reach out to them for trauma-informed care. They actually specialize with people that have been justice impacted. So I really love their work. Nick may have some others in Southeastern Michigan or over in the Detroit area, but I just overall just think like find someone that works for you. And don't allow that, and this is a men and women problem, but like particularly for men, it's hard for men to come to the table and say, look, I'm messed up and I need help. So you might have to really kind of like coach them into it a little bit more than you might have to for females that are looking for assistance.
Yeah, and what I can add in there, because I know we talked, the distinction between the two. For a lot of the women, these type of like support groups, reentry groups and things like that just doesn't exist. And if they do, it's not meant to really acknowledge and talk about the hardship that women go through. As far as like support groups, everything Aaron said, I know we're like two different cities or two different states away, but look for those grassroots communities that's right there in your area. A lot of those that's dealing with healing, dealing with trauma. Just because like a lot of folks talk about trauma doesn't mean that they have the analogy to work with trauma, especially with folks that's been through the criminal justice system. And the truth be told is it's not a ton of resources that's out there to address these type of instances. But as Aaron just said, they do exist. And yeah, those that's right there in the community are probably like the best ones to hit for.
Thank you so much. I want to give our panelists a virtual round of applause for being here with us and sharing their powerful narratives and thoughts on mass incarceration and prison reform. If you have any additional questions, feel free to either send them to me via email and I will direct them to the panelists and actually put you in contact with them. Most of you should have my email or social media contacts. If you're on social media, you can inbox me your question and I will send it to the panelists for you. Thank you so much and have a great evening. Hakeem, Aaron, Ahmad, Nick, thanks again. Always a pleasure doing this with you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Yep, same, bro. I'll talk to you.
Thank you, Charles.